It's wonderful to be here, and I absolutely agree with Rutger in these troubled times. We need uplifting and inspiring and heartwarming stories. Unfortunately, I did spend the last decade writing a book about the most notorious and controversial and perhaps irredeemably malignant composer in musical history, Richard Wagner. And this is the book, Wagnerism. It's not actually about the man himself, it's about his influence and his shadow. The subtitle is Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. From the mid-19th century onward, a remarkable array of writers and painters and poets, architects, dancers, filmmakers, philosophers, were affected in one way or another by Wagner. And some embraced him, some rejected him, some wavered back and forth between extremes. But in one way or another, their orbit was affected by the gravitational field of this huge planet Wagner. And the cast of characters in the book goes from Nietzsche to Baudelaire and Mallarmé to George Eliot, Thomas Mann, Willa Cather, W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodor Herzl, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, Joyce, Proust, Kandinsky, Eisenstein. It goes on and on. Obviously, in the brief time available tonight, I'm not going to be able to sum up these stories in any way. So I thought I'd talk about my own experiences with Wagner and how I found my way to a kind of cautious love for him. I don't pretend that these experiences are in any way anywhere near as interesting as those of the great gallery of figures that I mentioned, but perhaps they do show how Wagner still remains with us, despite periodic attempts to get rid of him, and how he is still evolving in the lives and minds of contemporary spectators. And I think I'm about to make a little bit of a fool of myself, but making a fool of oneself over Wagner is really the subject of the book. But I grew up with classical music in a very strict and traditional sense. It was all about Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, Mendelssohn. Maybe as I got a little older and became a rowdy teenager, I was listening to Mahler and Sibelius, but this was basically the music that I cared about, which, as you can imagine, made me tremendously popular at school. And I remember distinctly when I first tried to listen to Wagner, the music that I was accustomed to had very kind of clear formal organization and sort of demarcations. The first theme, the second theme, development, recapitulation, and so on. Whereas Wagner, and I brought home long playing records of Lohengrin from the public library, the early Romantic opera Lohengrin, most famous for the Wedding March, which has been heard at countless millions of weddings, despite the fact that the wedding in Lohengrin is actually a complete catastrophe, but no matter about that. When I listened to Wagner, I couldn't detect sort of themes as such. The preludes of Lohengrin, I sort of heard this slowly spreading musical goo, kind of one thing bleeding into another, and I didn't like it at all. I felt rather sick to my stomach and returned the records to the library the next day. Some years later, I was at university and I was heavily immersed in European history and literature of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the glorious shadowy epic of the fin de siècle, of decadence and symbolism and early modernism. And Wagner was always lurking in this period and looming as this kind of vampiric presence, Nosferatu casting his shadow on the wall, a menacing presence. And I was very much aware of his anti-Semitism, his influence on German hyper-nationalist ideology, the way in which he pointed forward to Nazism, Adolf Hitler's great fondness for the composer. And so Wagner presented himself to me as this gigantic intellectual problem, and not necessarily as someone to be loved and embraced. But nonetheless, I was listening to more of the music, and I remember I was particularly attracted in sort of as a late adolescent to the gloomiest, most doom-laden passages in Wagner, the prelude to Act 3 of Tristan und Isolde, or Hagen's Watch from Goethe-Dämmerung. Then in my 20s, I began to experience Wagner in the theater, which is really the only way you can fully experience him, because these spectacular excerpts that we hear in Hollywood movies, The Ride of the Valkyries and so on, can give a somewhat misleading idea of what he's all about. And I realized how Wagner was, in fact, a remarkably acute psychological composer and dramatist. The Ring Cycle is like a sort of great 19th century bourgeois novel in a lot of ways. On the surface, it's this sort of cartoonish affair of heroes and gods and dwarves and magic swords and dragons, but underneath, it's sort of a series of these finely etched psychological portraits. And Wotan is like the patriarch of a great family in decline, and he's grasping after new technologies and trying to forge new alliances to perpetuate his power. But in fact, he ensures his own destruction. And for me, it wasn't just a intellectual understanding, but also I developed this personal connection and this sense of how my own life and my own feelings were mirrored back to me in the music, and in sometimes somewhat embarrassing ways. At a certain point, I sort of fell into the habit of inviting some object of my affections, in this case, another young man, to a Wagner performance, in the hope that somehow a combination of the magic spell of the music and my own careful explication of the plot would lead to some kind of romantic breakthrough or epiphany, which really didn't happen. And there's one particularly ludicrous and painful moment where there was one a brief relationship that I sort of prematurely tried to consecrate by inviting my boyfriend to attend the entire Ring Cycle of the San Francisco Opera with me, somehow as a affirmation of our youthful love. And in fact, the relationship wasn't really working out, mostly unbeknownst to me, thanks in part to my emotional immaturity and was no need to relitigate all of this after 20 years. But after the second night of the cycle, Die Valkyrie, immediately after Brunhilde has been consigned to the Ring of Fire and Wotan has kissed her godhead away, I was informed in the rental car that the relationship needed to come to an end. Unfortunately, I was very determined not to appear to be unduly affected by this reversal. And so I insisted that my boyfriend, now ex-boyfriend, and I should continue to attend the cycle together. These progressively longer voyages into the heart of Wagnerian darkness, Siegfried, which goes on for 5.5 hours, Goethe-Dämmerung, which can last a full 6 hours, sitting next to this handsome guy who's no longer interested in me, feeling this maelstrom of rage and humiliation and confusion and despair, and of course, grandiose self-pity. And this was exactly the moment at which I finally understood Wagner. because this welter of emotion and these collisions of contradictory emotions are what his operas are all about. I won't carry on in this embarrassing vein, and I should make clear that there's only 1 or 2 pages at the very end of the book which are like this, and everything else is kind of just good, tedious cultural history. But the point is, I think, that Wagner, and I think this applies to so many of these outsized artistic figures from history, work upon us in this very complicated and fundamentally double-sided way. And on the one hand, there's the historical fact of the work and all the enormous historical baggage which comes with a figure like Wagner and the overwhelming force of the personality of the creator himself in this case. But then we as spectators have power to reshape the work and stamp it with our own extremely personal meanings. And the annals of Wagnerism are full of such radical and wildly idiosyncratic reinventions of the work. And of course, it is also mediated by the singers who bring their own personalities to the music, and the conductors who reshape the interpretations, and the directors who can have very startling new conceptions of what the work is all about. And so it's always changing. It's never fixed. And these double experiences sort of unfold side by side, and it's not a matter of choosing between them. We are aware of the history, but we also value our private understandings. Music reflects its maker, and it reflects ourselves. And at a time when we are struggling to come to terms with the damaged and damaging specter of artists of the past, the case of Wagner shows us that there's always another chapter to be written, and he remains with us, like it or not, unbearable and unavoidable, a magnifying mirror of the grandeur and the misery of our species. As Willa Cather so beautifully wrote, ever darkening, ever brightening. Thank you very much.